Hello everyone, welcome to week 5 of Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to switch gears again and we're going to start talking about the philosophy of religion. Specifically, we're going to review a few different proofs for and against the existence of God. Okay, so before we jump in, I want to make it very clear, I don't really care what your individual religious beliefs are. It's not my goal here to convince you one way or the other, right? Regardless of what you believe, my goal is just to inform you as to what's going on in this conversation, right? Maybe you'll continue to believe what you believe, but in a more educated and grounded way, right? It doesn't really matter to me at the end of the day which one of these sides of the position you come out on, right? Just that you've thought about it. That's it. Okay, so what are the positions at stake? Well, first, there's theism, right? Which is just the general belief that there is a God. Theism can be broken down into several different views, right? There's monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, deism. We'll talk about each one of those on the next slide. Then we have non-theisms. This is the lack of belief in any God. Here we see agnosticism and atheism. So really quickly, let's jump into the subcategories here. Monotheism is the belief that there is a God and only one of them, right? Just one God. Polytheism, the view that there's many gods, right? Poly, right? There's multiple gods. Pantheism is the view that everything is God, right? So maybe the universe as a whole is God in some respect. Or in other ways of thinking, there really is only one thing, one unified whole, and we call that thing God. There's a lot of different ways you might be a pantheist. Deists have the view that there is a God, but that we cannot and do not have a personal relationship with them. Right? Deism is often attributed as this God of a clockwork universe, right? God sort of set everything in order, kind of pushed the start button, and walked away. Right? So God is just this sort of initiator of the world, but is not currently involved with it. Non-theisms now. Agnosticism, simply put, just says, I do not now believe in a God. Atheism, however, says there is no God. Right? So we should keep in mind here the distinction that we made between the Pyrrhonian and the academic skeptic. Right? These two positions do not strictly correlate with Pyrrhonian and academic skepticism, but just like how the academic was making the strong assertion that we cannot have knowledge, while the Pyrrhonian was making a weaker sort of assertion about just being unwilling to say that we do have knowledge, we see the same thing here, right? The atheist is saying, I'm going to make this strong assertion, there is no God, where the agnostic is just withholding any kind of agreement as to whether there is one, right? So it's a very similar kind of relationship here. Okay, so within the philosophy of religion, there's really 3 main arguments that we point to that are used to try to prove God's existence, right? These are supposed to be proof for, not just evidence for, proof for, okay? These arguments are the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument. Let's start with the ontological proof for God's existence. It's unique in that it's entirely logical. This means that it's a priori, right? It's a priori. A priori meaning that we can get it from reason alone. We don't need to experience anything. We don't need to gather evidence from the world. This is supposed to show us that God must be real, must exist from reason alone, right? This makes it very unique. Because it goes from reason alone, we can see why in the meditations, the parts of the meditations that we didn't read, Descartes prefers this kind of proof, right? So in order to get himself out of this hole of doubt that he has created for himself, Descartes ultimately is going to latch onto something like the ontological proof. If he can get God, then he can get more or less everything else back too. Okay, so how does the argument work? There's a number of different ways of presenting it, but they have a similar form. The form goes something like this. Premise 1. God, by definition, is a supremely perfect being. Premise 2, I can conceive of God with my mind. Premise 3, that which can only be conceived of by the mind, but does not exist in reality, is less than perfect. A proper conception of God, then, is necessarily one in which God exists. Conclusion, therefore, God has to exist. Okay, so let's unpack this. The idea here is that if we assume that God is a necessarily perfect being, right? God is perfect, and I say that I can conceive of God, that means I can conceive of God as a perfect being, right? But a being that exists only in my mind as a conception, not as a real thing, is not perfect. Why? Because it's missing the quality of actually existing. And you can't be perfect if you're missing the quality of actually existing, right? Therefore, because we know God by definition has to be perfect, God can't merely exist in your mind. God must exist out there, must actually exist, right? That's how the ontological argument goes. So there's a number of different responses to the ontological argument, both from non-theists and theists, right? The first and most notable kind of response we get to this kind of proof is a form of reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum in the Latin just means reduced to the absurd, right? It's a kind of counter argument. The way a reductio ad absurdum works is you assume all of the premises of the person you're arguing against. So you say, I'm going to grant you everything. And then I'm going to show you that that leads to absurd conclusions. Therefore, we should reject at least some of what you were proposing, right? So that's what this kind of response tries to do. Assume that this kind of argument works. What are the results of it, right? The move goes something like this. I can imagine a supremely perfect island. Actually existing would be more perfect than being merely imagined. Therefore, this supremely perfect island must exist, right? So they try to use the same moves, just not about God, right? It seems like you can attribute perfection to anything at all, and demonstrate that, well, because merely conceiving of it would be less perfect than it actually existing, it must then actually exist. Now, there is a response to this that proponents, people who actually use the ontological argument, have available to them. Typically, they say something like, well, okay, you could do that, but God is the only necessarily perfect being, right? It's in God's essence to be perfect. There's nothing about an island that makes it perfect by necessity, and therefore you don't get to use the same move. Okay, maybe that works. More responses. Another is to attack this idea that we can sort of deduce something's existence from mere reason alone, right? That we don't require any evidence or anything like that, that we can merely intuit or reason our way to something's existence. David Hume is the most famous critic who uses this kind of attack. His idea is that existence is not a predicate. Existence is not a quality, right? Where a quality or a predicate are just things that we can ascribe to something, like a characteristic, right? He wants to say that existence is not one of those kind of things. And therefore, to say that something is missing existence is not to say that it is not completely perfect, right? That it's somehow unwhole in its perfection. No, existence can't be ascribed in that way. Or a thing doesn't have existence. It either exists or it doesn't, right? There are some critical responses to the ontological proof that come from theists as well, specifically from a group of theists who say that God's nature is not comprehensible to us, right? We are, in essence of being human, limited, right? We are limited, and if you are to make the claim that we can conceive of God and all of God's perfection, which the ontological argument seems to suggest we can do, you are in some way elevating yourself to God's level, which is not only impossible, but perhaps sacrilegious, right? So There's plenty of room here to object to the ontological argument, but it is still nevertheless very interesting. Okay, moving on. The cosmological proof. The cosmological proof is less a priori. It doesn't really have to do with reason alone, but it is going to fall prey to some similar, though not exact, criticisms. We'll soon see. Okay, so the cosmological argument usually runs something like this. Once again, there's a lot of different forms of it, but it typically goes something like this. Premise 1, every effect has a cause. Premise 2, the universe then must have had a cause. Premise 3, the universe could not have caused itself because it would have to exist prior to itself. That doesn't make any sense. Therefore, God must exist, right? So the idea here then, again, this is not purely a priori because we are, this notion that every effect has a cause is something we have discovered, right? That's a thing that we've discovered. Okay, the idea here then is, since the universe must have come into being at some point and it could not have caused itself, something that is itself uncaused must have brought it about. The only candidate for that, so the argument goes, is God. All right, so God is the first mover or first principle, the thing that gets it all going, right? So there's a few available responses to the cosmological argument, and we're only going to talk about the most prevalent of them. The first is that the argument leads to something like an infinite regress, right? If everything is caused by something, then something must have caused that which caused the universe, and on and on and on. So if your idea is the universe must have been caused because all effects have causes, and we're going to call that cause God, then it seems like you ought to say, well, God had a cause too. And whatever caused God is going to have a cause as well, and so on and on and on. Proponents of the cosmological argument typically say that, no, the reason why we're choosing God as the best candidate for this first cause, this first principle, is because God is eternal. God is the only thing that is uncaused. There's a further exchange, right, where people making this criticism now want to say something like, that notion that God is the only uncaused thing is very ad hoc, right? You just told me that everything had to have a cause, and now you're saying, except God. How come God gets the exception? Why can't we extend that exception elsewhere? Can you see how this kind of mirrors what we were seeing with the ontological argument, right? We wanted to say, well, I can talk about perfect islands too. And the response to that was to say, no, perfection is a trait unique to God, right? Well, in this case, it now seems like an uncaused existence is unique to God, right? Okay. Further, some argue, citing things like, well, not things like, but the Big Bang, that the universe is capable of causing itself. And therefore, talk of there being nothing before the universe is sort of meaningless, right? There is no sense in which there was a before the universe, if the Big Bang Theory is true, right? Okay, whether or not this works kind of depends on cosmology, right? So we can't really get into it philosophically. Okay. Finally, I think most interestingly, there is this problem that we call the identity problem. We're going to see identity problems more as we go on, so pay close attention here. An identity problem happens when you have a proof that tries to prove the existence of something specific, but what it actually ends up doing is just suggesting that something or other exists here, right? So you go in with the goal of proving, for example, that God exists. But what you end up achieving is just proving that something must exist that is capable of causing the universe. Need that thing be God is the question, right? Okay, so in the case of the cosmological argument, it's supposed to be proving the existence of God, right? It seems like, let me just read this really quick. It seems that it could only ever actually prove the existence of some being that precedes the universe. Right. Okay. So once again, the idea here is that while it's intending to prove something very specific, God's existence, right? Instead, really all it's doing is proving that there must be something that caused the universe. that thing must be God is a further leap, right? It is not a thing that is granted by the argument itself. So it doesn't establish the identity of the thing that it tries to prove. It could have been any number of things, right? Why must it have been God? Okay. Now, of course, the person trying to use the cosmological argument is going to say, well, it needed to be God because God is the only thing that possesses these specific properties. Maybe there's room there, right? Maybe there's room. But that's where we're going to start having the debate then. Okay, so it does not necessarily follow that this being shares any of the traits commonly associated with God, right? The thing that caused the universe, even if the cosmological argument works, even if it works and we can establish that something exists which had to cause the universe, it does not necessarily follow that that thing has all of these traits that we normally think of as belonging to God, like omniscience, omnipotence, goodness, etc. You don't necessarily need any of those things to be a causer of the universe, right? So there is this problem of identity. We've established existence. We have not established identity. Okay. Wrapping up then with the teleological proof. The teleological proof is far and away different from the ontological proof in that it is purely a posteriori. Rather than a priori, it's a posteriori. This means that instead of being derived from reason alone, it's derived from experience alone. Experience or evidence, right? You probably already know this argument, but you might have heard it being called something like the argument from design, right? It's the argument from design. Generally speaking, it goes something like this. Premise 1, the universe and the things within it are remarkably complex. Premise 2, complexity of this magnitude should not be possible without someone to have engineered or designed it. Therefore, the universe must have a designer. So the basic idea is just this. I can see all the complexity around me. This kind of complexity isn't possible without intentional direction. Therefore, there must be someone behind this. And what better candidate than God? That's how the teleological proof or the argument from design works. Yeah. Okay. Usually, this kind of argument is presented with an analogy of some kind to better make the point. The watch and the watchmaker is the standard analogy that we get from William Paley. Here's the quote. Suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think that, for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for a stone that happened to be lying on the ground? For this reason and for no other, namely that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, if a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any order that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. Okay, so in other words, we assume that the watch is designed when we find it on the beach. We don't assume that the watch has always been there. Why? Because it has such intricacy. The complexity of it shows us that had this been even slightly different, it could not be what it is, right? Therefore, it is natural for us, indeed right for us, argues Paley, for us to assume that the watch has a watchmaker, right? Contrast this with just a stone lying on the beach. We don't see its intricacies, right? We only see the intricacies when we look at something like a watch. Now, the analogy is this. The universe, in all of its complexities, is exactly this way, right? When we look at all of the complexities of the universe, it's like encountering the watch on the beach, right? It's so complex that it seems like it must have been engineered, right? That is the teleological argument. Remember how I told you the identity problem is going to come up again? It comes up in a big way against the teleological proof. So again, let's suppose that it's true that everything we've discovered is so intricate that it had to be designed. So let's give the teleological proof all that it wants, right? Sure, you proved that there's a designer, but it doesn't follow necessarily that the identity of that designer is God. It could have been any number of things, right? Perhaps everything that you and I are familiar with has been designed by hyper-intelligent, extra-dimensional aliens, right? Or maybe we're living in a very finely crafted simulation, and so everything we know of to be the universe is created, but not by a god, right? Not by a god, right? So the identity problem, once again, is that you can perhaps prove the existence of something without establishing its identity. The teleological argument runs into this problem head on, right? This is the major problem for the teleological proof. Other criticisms typically focus on this inference that the teleological proof makes from complexity to design, right? So just because we're accustomed to associating complex things like watches to designers, the response is that it doesn't follow necessarily that complex things had to be designed, right? Maybe some complex things come about through natural processes. So, for example, we could talk about natural selection over millions of years, right? There are many different ways, many different alternatives of suggesting that complexity can emerge out of something less complex, right? Naturally, without the need of any careful hand guiding it in that direction, right? Okay, so these are the three proofs for God's existence, but there's also a way in which we could sort of try to motivate a belief in God that isn't necessarily to do with proof at all, right? So Pascal's wager is the one that I want to talk about here, right? Blaise Pascal, gives us a wager. We call it Pascal's wager, okay? Here's how the argument goes. If you've come to the conclusion that there's no reason to believe in God, then consider this. If you're wrong and God does exist, then you risk your eternal happiness by refusing to believe in God. However, if you are right that God doesn't exist and you believe in God anyway, you don't risk anything, right? There's no downside. Therefore, you should attempt to believe in God even if you don't think it's reasonable, because the risk is too great if you're wrong, and the cost is practically nothing for hedging your bets, right? So this is certainly not an attempt at proving that God exists, but it's trying to convince us that it is reasonable to believe that God exists, even if you don't have evidence or proof or anything like that. Why? Well, because if you're right that God doesn't exist, okay, you haven't lost anything in choosing to believe. But if you choose to believe and you end up being right, you've gained so much, is the idea, right? So as you can see, Pascal is not offering us a proof. Instead, he's trying to convince us it's a reasonable thing to believe in, even if we don't have proof. Now, there are a ton of back and forth objections here, right? Pascal's wager has generated a lot of response, right? So the first response here is to suggest that, look, refusing or believing in God, even if you think that's unreasonable, does not come with no cost, right? In fact, believing in God sometimes, if not often, requires us to sacrifice certain things like earthly pleasures. So Pascal is not correct in saying that the wager cost us nothing, right? It might be that it costs us a great deal. Pascal's response is going to be something like, okay, but any kind of earthly pleasure or whatever that you end up sacrificing in order to take the wager is still going to be outweighed by the potential of an eternal afterlife. Whether or not that works is an interesting question. All right. A more sort of creative objection to this wager idea is a counter wager, right? So the idea is this. Imagine that there is a God and there is an eternal life, right? But that God only grants this eternal life to people who refuse to believe in God. Well, there's nothing in principle wrong with that idea, right? It could be that the world is that way. Okay, well, if it could be that the world is that way, then we can construct an alternative wager to Pascal's, right? If you believe when you had no reason to, well, you lost out on your eternal reward. But if you chose not to believe because there was no reason to, you ended up winning, right? You ended up with the better alternative. So it seems like Pascal's wager really only works when we assume certain things about God, even though Pascal is saying that the wager doesn't require any evidence of God at all, right? So it's not clear that this wager of his is going to do the work that it purports to do. Okay, let's move on. Arguments for non-theism, right? We've seen some arguments for theism now. What about some arguments for non-theism? Most of the arguments against the existence of God focus on one or more of the properties that God is supposed to possess, right? So these properties are things like omniscience, knowing all things, omnipotence, having unlimited power or ability, being omnipresent, being eternal, being all good, all merciful, etc. So these kinds of arguments typically target those properties. The most prominent of these arguments is called the problem of evil. There's two different forms of it. They're very subtly different. One is the logical problem of evil, and the other is I suppose you could call it the evidential problem of evil. Let's talk about the logical problem of evil first. It's an attempt to prove that God does not exist. Right? So this is an atheistic proof. It's an attempt to prove that God does not exist. The argument goes like this. Premise 1. If there were an omnipotent, omniscient, supremely good being, then evil would not exist. Premise 2. There is evil. Conclusion, therefore, no such being exists. Right? Okay, so the idea here then is these properties are things that God is. Right? These are properties that make God what God is supposed to be. That God is omnipotent, omniscient, supremely good, etc. Right? Well, if God really possessed all of those things, then there could not be evil, right? Children could not die of cancer. There would not be genocides. There would not be like parasites and bacteria that destroy innocent lives, etc. Right? But the fact is, those things do exist. Okay? We cannot square the fact that those things exist with the fact that God has all of these properties, or God is supposed to have all of these properties. Therefore, God can't exist. That's how the argument goes. Here's why it's supposed to work, right? If God is omnipotent, then you can't say that God couldn't have done anything about it, right? No, you're saying God has all the power. God definitely could have done something about it. If you're saying that God is also omniscient, then you're saying that God knew what all the possible consequences were of God's creation, right? They knew going in what was going to happen. Right? If they're supremely good, then it means that they're not willing to make any exceptions for evil, right? So when you have these three things combined together, it seems like there's no room for anything like evil to exist. Okay. The evidential problem of evil is just that God can't have all of these properties all at once, right? So it's a challenge towards these properties, less towards God's existence altogether. Right, so the argument goes something like this. Evil exists, right? There's suffering, there's pain, there's death. If God is omniscient, then they are aware of this evil. If God is supremely good, then they would do whatever they can to end this evil. If God is omnipotent, then they have the ability to end this evil now. Okay? Therefore, because there is evil, God is either not omnipotent, not omniscient, or not supremely good. God cannot be all of these things. And if you think that God must be all of these things, then we fall into the logical problem of evil, right? Where the person is going to suggest that that just means God can't exist. This argument is usually followed up with the following kind of analysis, right? If you're about sacrificing any one of these properties. So if you say that God is omnipotent, but is not omniscient, so God is all powerful but doesn't know everything, then it follows us that God is being careless with their power, right? They are carelessly subjecting us to evil. If God is omniscient but not omnipotent, so they know everything but they're not all powerful, then it follows that God knowingly chose to bring about a world full of evil, knowing that they don't have the power to change it, right? So again, it makes them kind of reckless, if not evil. If God is omnipotent and omniscient, but not good, then God is a tyrant, right? So the idea here is that if God is all powerful and God knows everything, but isn't good, well, then that's not a being that we want to worship, right? That's some kind of evil deity, right? Okay, so that's the problem of evil. Now, there are a lot of responses to it. The problem of evil has been around forever, right? It's been around since there have been gods, more or less, right? So even the ancient Greeks who were polytheistic felt the need to address this problem. This is what we see in Plato's Euthyphro, which is very good. I recommend it. Probably the most common response, this is a response that Descartes uses, is that evil isn't really a force all of its own. It's not something that God creates or chooses to allow, but rather evil is somehow an absence. In the same way that darkness is an absence of light, evil is an absence of God or God's presence, right? So evil is only experienced then when one is separate from God, right? And in this way, if you use this move, you don't have to accept the conclusion that God has in some way created evil or possibly even allowed evil, right? Another kind of response that you might use, and this is another thing that Descartes points to, is that evil exists as a necessary consequence of us having free will, right? That God does not want evil to exist, but nevertheless finds it a necessity for us as humans to have free will. And so while God would prefer there be no evil, it's the case that God is going to allow us to make our own choices, and some of those lead to evil. Now, while that appeal might be attractive, it's hard to square that with some of the things that the people making the case for the problem of evil are using. Right, they're using things like natural disasters and child famine, things like parasitic infections that eat away at your brain, that kind of thing. It doesn't seem like there's something we have done necessarily that explains why those things exist, right? So there's going to be a lot of work to do there if that's the kind of response you want to use. And finally, there are some who argue that, well, what we perceive as evil is actually still necessary to God's plan, right? In the end, it will all make sense, right? Or perhaps we simply aren't capable of seeing the glory of God's plan, right? So our inability to see the divine plan, to understand the inner workings of God's mind, leads to this confusion, right? So the problem of evil is more of a confusion than any genuine problem. Okay, there's a lot of back and forth that can be had there. Lastly, there is this notion that we shouldn't be arguing about God's existence at all. This comes out of theism, right? So there are some theists who think that, look, there's no way you can prove God's existence. In fact, you shouldn't be attempting to. Right? So fideism is this position, right? Fideism is the position that reason and faith do not mix when it comes to trying to discover truths about God or the divine, right? Truths about God for the fideist can only be gotten through divine revelation. They can only be gotten if God gives them to you. You cannot get there using your own reason. You'll never be able to access the divine using your own reason. So this is kind of a bankrupt project to begin with. One philosopher who aligns somewhat with the fideist is Søren Kierkegaard. So very quickly, for our last slide here, we're going to talk about Kierkegaard. Okay. So Kierkegaard himself is not opposed to reason in principle, but he does think that in order to have appropriate faith, in order to have an appropriate relationship with the divine, you have to sometimes relinquish your reason. You have to let go of it, right? So for Kierkegaard, then, faith is a matter of trust. It's a matter of trust and resigning of one's own reason as a matter of suspending it, right? You suspend it in order to have faith. Therefore, faith or belief in the divine in general is a leap, right? We talk about a leap of faith. There's nothing I can do, Kierkegaard wants to say, to convince you to believe as I do, right? There's nothing I can do. Why? Because it's not done through reason. It's done through a leap of faith, right? So this idea that I try to convince you that God exists, either with proofs or with a less formal method like Pascal's wager, these things aren't going to work. Why? Because the only way to have a real connection with the divine is through this leap of faith, right? To temporarily suspend reason and use faith instead. So Kierkegaard might argue that you can engage in apologetics in an attempt to prove the divine, but that kind of misses the point of believing, since it demonstrates that you are not yet ready to let go of your reason and begin to trust instead, right? So this conversation in the philosophy of religion has many different twists and turns, right? There are some apologists who want to say, look, we can prove that God exists. We saw 3 arguments where they attempted to do so. Some say, well, look, maybe I can't prove to you that God exists, but I can show you that it's still reasonable to believe that God exists, like Pascal's wager, right? But then we saw on the non-theist side that maybe there's some reason for thinking that God doesn't exist, right? How are we going to account for evil in the world if God exists and God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good, right? Finally, we saw that maybe this is the wrong way to go about it for the believer in God altogether, right? Maybe they shouldn't be concerned with trying to provide us proofs, right? Maybe that's not what religious belief is all about. Well, whatever the case may be, that's it for the topic this week. I hope you found it interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts. Until next week, stay healthy, stay safe.